Starved behind bars. America's hidden prison food torture exposed. True crime documentary. The screams started before sunrise. Metal trays slammed against the cell bars as hungry men shouted for real food, not the gray, foul-smelling paste they had been given for days. Guards walked by without looking at them, pretending not to hear. It was during this moment that one inmate collapsed, his body hitting the concrete floor so loudly that even the officers froze. The man had been begging for help the night before, saying he felt too weak to stand. Now he was not moving at all. This was not a movie scene. It was real, and it was terrifying. The remaining men huddled together, some trembling, some shaking with anger, all of them too weak to even lift their fists. One guard finally stepped into the hallway and shouted for everyone to back away, but the inmates refused. They yelled that people were fainting, people were sick, and that the food, if it could even be called food, was slowly killing them. Before the guard could respond, another inmate grabbed the bars and cried out, "We're humans, not animals!" His voice cracked, and for a moment, there was complete silence on the entire block. Then alarms blasted through the prison, warning the officers that the unit was close to erupting. The guard stepped back and reached for his radio, but his hands were shaking. Even he knew things had gone too far. Right before officers stormed the unit, one inmate whispered loud enough for others to hear, "If they bring that loaf again, someone will die." That was the cliffhanger moment, because the officers were rolling in a cart, and on top of that cart was exactly what the inmates feared: the punishment loaf, a dense, grayish block of blended bread, vegetables, and beans baked into a shape meant to punish rather than feed. How did things reach this breaking point? The story goes back to Maricopa County Jail in Arizona under Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Known for his harsh and controversial methods, Arpaio's system used food as a tool to control inmates. The punishment loaf, or neutral loaf as some called it, was served for minor infractions: talking too loudly, refusing to stand fast enough, or arguing with a guard. It was not designed to nourish, it was designed to punish. Inmates described it as dry, flavorless, and nearly impossible to chew. Some vomited after eating it. Others said they were locked in their cold cells with only water and the loaf for days. Heat, stress, and starvation combined to make them weak and dizzy, unable to think clearly or even walk properly. Some men reported that guards would watch and laugh as they struggled to eat, enjoying the control it gave them. The conditions inside Maricopa County Jail were extreme. Inmates were crammed into hot cells, sometimes without fans or air conditioning. Meals were small, repetitive, and often spoiled. And when men complained of illness or fainting, officers dismissed them as faking. Medical help often arrived too late. Investigations later revealed that inmates had lost significant weight and suffered severe dehydration and malnutrition. One man even told reporters that eating the loaf felt like biting punishment itself. Despite complaints, lawsuits, and media coverage, Arpaio's system continued for years. The loaf became infamous. It was more than just a meal. It was a symbol of the jail's control, cruelty, and indifference. Back in the cell block, the cart carrying the punishment loaf stopped in front of the shouting men. The officer stared at them, gripping the cart handle tightly. He knew this moment could explode into violence. The inmates knew it too. And as he reached down to grab the first gray, hard loaf, someone in the back yelled something that made every guard freeze. Because this time, the inmates were not only hungry, they were ready to fight back. The air inside the cell block was thick with tension. Guards froze as the inmates stared at the cart, eyes wide, fists clenched. Some of the men had not eaten anything for nearly 2 days. Their stomachs growled like wild animals, but it was not just hunger that filled them, it was anger. When the officer reached for the first gray, hard loaf, someone shouted, "Not again!" The sound echoed off the concrete walls like a warning drum. For a moment, no one moved. Then, one man kicked the cart, sending it wobbling. Another grabbed a tray and threw it against the bars. Chaos erupted. Officers shouted orders, but the inmates were not listening. They were pushing, shoving, and screaming for their basic rights, food that would not make them sick. The scene turned violent in seconds. A guard was knocked to the floor, and someone yelled that the loaf is killing people. Finally, backup arrived. More officers poured in, shields and batons in hand. They forced the inmates back into their cells, locking them behind heavy metal doors. But the fear and anger lingered. Many of the men were weak, their bodies trembling from hunger and heat. Others were furious, their voices raw from shouting. The loaf sat on the cart, untouched and ominous, a silent threat that would not be forgotten. This was not the first time Maricopa County Jail had seen such a scene. Reports and lawsuits have been piling up for years. Investigations revealed that under Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the jail had served prisoners rotten meat, green bologna, and the punishment loaf for infractions as small as talking back to guards or moving too slowly. The loaf was not a meal, it was a brick of humiliation and suffering. Inmates described it as dry, tasteless, and sometimes moldy. Eating it could cause vomiting, dehydration, and severe weight loss. One former inmate told reporters that he had been given the loaf for refusing to clean a cell that was already filthy. "I lost over 10 pounds in a week," he said. "Every bite felt like punishment. You could taste the anger baked in it." Another man said the loaf made him so sick that he could not leave his bed for 2 days. Medical staff sometimes visited, but they were often limited by rules, understaffing, or indifference. The use of the loaf was defended by Sheriff Arpaio as necessary discipline, a way to maintain order. But courts and human rights organizations disagreed. Lawsuits argued that forcing inmates to eat only the punishment loaf violated basic human rights. Some inmates claimed the experience caused long-term health problems, including chronic stomach issues, malnutrition, and mental health struggles from the stress and humiliation. Back in the present, the memory of that morning in the cell block haunted both inmates and guards. Men whispered to each other through the bars, sharing their fear and anger, trying to find strength in numbers. They knew they could not stop the system alone, but small acts of defiance became their lifeline. One man refused the loaf entirely, sitting silently as officers stared at him. Another refused to enter the dining hall until guards promised no loaf would be served. Outside the jail, families and lawyers were beginning to pay attention. Letters from inmates reached newspapers and advocacy groups, and stories of starvation and mistreatment started spreading. Public outrage grew slowly at first, then faster. Questions were being asked. How could this continue in the United States? How could a jail punish its own people with food meant to destroy them? As the day ended, guards wheeled the loaf away, but its shadow remained. Inmates huddled in their bunks, exhausted but determined. They whispered about lawsuits, media stories, and survival strategies. Some cried quietly, others stared at the walls, imagining a day when punishment like this would end. And as night fell, one man looked up from his bunk and whispered, "Tomorrow, we fight back in another way." The tension was far from over. The struggle inside Maricopa County Jail had only just begun. The next morning, the tension inside Maricopa County Jail was electric. Inmates sat quietly, their bodies weak, but their minds sharp. They knew the punishment loaf would return, but this time they were ready in a different way. Instead of yelling or throwing trays, they began documenting everything. They wrote letters, passed notes, and secretly recorded the poor conditions on their phones and small cameras. Outside the jail, attorneys, journalists, and human rights groups had finally started paying close attention. The shocking stories from Maricopa County were spreading through newspapers, television reports, and local government offices. Families of inmates demanded answers. "How can someone be punished by food?" one mother asked, tears in her eyes. "This is America. How is this allowed?" Soon, lawsuits were filed against Sheriff Joe Arpaio and the jail administration. Inmates claimed the punishment loaf violated their basic human rights, arguing that forcing people to eat it caused physical harm and psychological suffering. Medical reports backed up their claims. Weight loss, dehydration, fainting spells, and even long-term health problems. Lawyers pointed to videos and letters from inmates describing moldy bread, green bologna, and the gray, tasteless brick that had become infamous. The media coverage caused public outrage. Local news channels ran stories showing the conditions inside the jail, with former inmates describing their experiences. National outlets picked up the story. Activists called it food torture, while politicians debated whether such practices should be banned completely. Even federal agencies began reviewing the policies at Maricopa County Jail. Inside the jail, officers knew they were under scrutiny. Some became defensive, others worried about the legal consequences. Inmates, however, felt a surge of hope. They had suffered for years, but now the world was finally listening. They shared strategies, helped each other stay strong, and kept documenting everything. Small acts of resistance, once dangerous, became a way to survive while also building evidence.
Eventually, the pressure forced changes. The use of the punishment loaf was drastically reduced, and new policies were introduced to protect inmates from cruel and unusual punishment. Medical care improved, and oversight committees were established to ensure food quality met basic nutrition standards. Many former inmates received settlements through lawsuits, though nothing could erase the trauma they endured. The story of the Maricopa County Jail punishment loaf became a symbol of a larger problem in the U.S. prison system. It reminded the public that even in modern America, cruelty could exist behind bars, hidden from everyday life. And it showed the power of perseverance, how the voices of those suffering, when heard, could lead to real change. Years later, former inmates still spoke about the loaf, the hunger, and the fear. They remembered collapsing in cells, watching friends faint, and feeling trapped by a system designed to punish rather than rehabilitate. But they also remembered the courage it took to speak out, to write letters, and to survive despite the odds. And while Maricopa County Jail eventually ended many of its harshest practices, the story remains a warning. Starvation as punishment is not just a horror of the past, it is a real danger that can happen when oversight fails and power goes unchecked. The inmates who survived the punishment loaf left behind a legacy of truth and resilience. Their suffering exposed one of the darkest chapters in American prison history, forcing a system to face its own cruelty. In the end, the gray brick that caused so much pain became a symbol not of defeat, but of justice, awareness, and the fight to ensure that no one would be starved behind bars again.